All right, hey Brian, thanks so much for joining me, man. I'm excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to get into it.
Okay, so again, just for our listeners, give us job title, give us just kind of an overview of your day to day. What are you doing?
So I am a contributing writer with Sports Illustrated, and I've been a journalist for, gosh, I'm aging myself, but more than 15 years now. I've been doing it ever since college. And day to day, I do mostly big feature work for SI. I've been on contract to do a handful of big stories for them every year since about 2019, after I started as a freelancer with them in 2017, and I'd held other jobs in the industry before that, worked my way up to SI. And it's a lot of staying plugged into the news every day and tracking headlines, and you'll see something splashy that happens and everyone covers it, and there's the daily hit stories, and then that goes in my file, and that's something I might revisit down the road. So it's a mix of being plugged into the news, a mix of gathering string and doing interviews for long pieces, and then a handful of times a year I sit down to write for a couple of weeks, and then you work through edits and fact checks. So it's kind of a blend of all those different duties, but all in the service of producing a few big stories a year.
Gotcha. Okay, no, that's interesting, and we'll spend a lot of time diving more so into the process that you alluded to there. But let's just start because you mentioned you've been in the business for a little while now, and you've been doing it since college. I'm curious just to explore, why writing, why feature pieces, as you noted, because there are a lot of different pathways you can take within journalism. Um, and maybe how has that purpose evolved over time from when it started, fresh out of school to where it is right now today?
It's a great question. So I would say the first part, why writing, not really. It's always been something I've been drawn to. When I was a kid, elementary school, I would write long fiction stories. I mean, I'm sure they're embarrassing if you went and read them now, but I just felt this compulsion to, if we had any free time in school, I'd sit down and write, and just loved it all the way up through elementary and middle school. And then that continued through high school. I got into sports. I played basketball. Barely got off the bench in high school, but loved sports and was on the team. Grew up a diehard Braves fan in Metro Atlanta, so I always loved sports. And then writing was just kind of always in the background. And as you're getting ready for college and determining where you want to go and what you might want to major in, I thought, oh, maybe I'll do business or something like that. And then it clicked to me. I don't remember if it was a friend at the time or parents or maybe just an amalgamation of people that knew me were just said, you've always loved writing. You know, that can be a career. And that the light bulb went off. And I thought, yes, let's go do that. So went to Emory, not really knowing if I was gonna, I thought, gosh, maybe I'll write fiction, I'll be a novelist or something like that. And very quickly realized, well, unless you're just superbly talented or lucky or a mix of both, good luck. And I needed to come up with something a little more concrete. And that's kind of where journalism came into the fold. So I double majored in creative writing and journalism and knew immediately I wanted to get into sports writing. I mean, this is back in the day when Bill Simmons was just starting out at ESPN on page two, and I was really drawn to kind of the columnist, analyst, kind of fun. He was breaking down barriers, sort of things. Very different than what I do now and what I've ever done, but that's what drew me in initially. And I think for a lot of people my age, pulled them into sports writing and loving that as it was evolving in the industry. Was sports editor at my college paper at Emory, and thought I'd want to get in there and cover games and do the analysis and on the field stuff, and that pivoted as my career wore on. I got lucky enough to get an internship with Business Week, which was super far afield from anything I wanted to do. But National Magazine, you're 21, go get the experience. And I'm glad I did because it taught me the mechanics of reporting. I'd always loved writing, but reporting I knew nothing about. Interviewing people, mining for details, leveraging documents to tell a story. And so that was really a trial by fire. And that internship devolved into a contract role for a couple of years that really taught me the nuts and bolts of reporting. I mean, I had a lot of bylines in the magazine, short ones, and there's no writing voice. Any distinctive writing you see in me now was not evident. That it was all just the facts. But that was really important because that served as the basis for what I do now, with a little more detail rich, vivid writing. I worked a couple jobs. I worked for U.S. News and World Report after Business Week, but really wanted to get back into sports. I just didn't have a network. I didn't know how am I going to make this pivot. So I got a master's in sports journalism from Indiana University, and mainly just to go to try to create a network within sports. And uh, long story short, it worked out through a few connections. Got a job working for the NCAA's magazine. someone I knew there, knew an editor at SI, and after I'd gotten more reps over several years, was able to land a cup of coffee with an editor at SI, and start doing work for them. But there was a big pivot within there because when I was in grad school, I covered a Super Bowl and a Final Four and a Big Ten championship, both in football and basketball. And I'd look around the room when I'm on deadline and see 400 other people writing the same thing. And that's what I thought I wanted to do. And then I realized, well, it's not as long lasting as I like. Like I grew up liking directors like Chris Nolan or Tarantino, where they, maybe they do one movie every 3 years, but it's like very singular and distinctive. And this sort of work felt more fleeting, and that's not to disparage it. I mean, there's people do great work on deadline. It's just not. It wasn't as rewarding as I thought it would be. And so that kind of nudged me over to more of the feature stuff where they take longer, they have maybe a little bit more staying power than your day to day grind. And that's ultimately kind of what led me to what I do today. That sentiment shift, and that's something that, to your point about evolving, that I had no clue that's the
Yeah.
route I was going to go, but through experience, that's kind of the path that I walked.
Right. No, that's interesting. But and within that, I guess sort of what you get out of it, or just again, the kind of the purpose behind it, has that also shifted to where you are today?
Yeah, it has because I came into it. I won't say selfishly, but I want to do something that I think is fun, which is
Yeah.
going to games and writing about it,
Completely,
right?
completely
Which is
understand. Yeah, no, and
right.
that's kind of what I want to get at. I think that's sort of
Yeah.
an arc that we all sort of go on. I just want to explore that for you personally. So yeah, early on, it's like I want to do cool stuff, right?
Right.
I want to
Exactly.
cover sports. I like sports. Like I want to write about it. I want to be there and all that. But how has that shifted, and what does it look like today?
Right, and so that's the starting point, especially once I went to grad school and was determined to cover sports. It was, let's go do the fun. It's got some glamour. It's cool to tell people at a cocktail party or at a bar, this is what I do. Go cover games, be on the road. That's great, and kudos to the people who do it. But as I started to do more feature work at the NCAA, and I would get great access to folks and started to cover, tragedies. A young runner who passed away after winning her first college race, and then we studied the effect it had on her teammates and her family. A young teenage mother who got a basketball scholarship to Florida Gulf Coast and had to wrestle balancing motherhood with her obligations to her team, her sport, and her schooling to try to extricate her and her son from a difficult family environment. And as you get to know these folks, you find it's really rewarding, kind of emotionally and on a personal level, and you develop strong bonds with people, and they uh, tell you that it was a cathartic experience. Oftentimes, you have these long interviews or spend a weekend with someone or get to know them and their family over the course of the weeks or months you're reporting something, and to them they say, "Oh, it's almost like therapy. It was good to have someone who wanted to listen and talk to me." And then if you report the piece thoroughly and accurately and deliver a good story, even if it's not necessarily they're not all favorable stories, but they're honest,
Mhm.
they tell you how much they appreciate it, and people in their circle appreciate it, and that added a level of meaning to it that I frankly would never have anticipated I was craving or needed or found fulfilling. Didn't even wasn't even on my radar that that would be an aspect of the job that would I'd find meaningful. Now, I don't know if it's the most impactful part of the job, but it's something that really matters a lot to me.
Mhm.
When it's done and you've chronicled something that someone's been through that's traumatic or difficult or a big inflection point in their life, and they say you got it right and that it meant a lot to them. That's really fulfilling, and that's
Right.
something when I went to grad school I would have had no clue was an aspect of the job.
Yeah, no, that's awesome and really cool to hear. We'll come back around, I think, when we sort of get to the end of whatever your process is. I want to come back to something and I'll make note of it here. But let's start then with, okay, now we know a little bit about your background, why you're doing it, how that's evolved, all of that. I want to spend the bulk of our time just taking a deeper dive into essentially from inception, an idea that you have, right? And you said maybe a mind, just paying attention to news, I'm seeing stories come through, whatever. Um, but how do you go from like, hey, that could be interesting, to I pick up Sports Illustrated and read an article you wrote?
Sure.
That's what I want to explore. And even if, just clicking through the website, looking at your portfolio, and you mentioned some of the stories that you had done. And I just made a list here, like, all right, they're on there. You feature like a Georgia high school football season, right? We've got a story on former NBA player Sean Bradley. You've got something in there from former NFL player Clinton Portis. The life story of a surfer, the 2021 murders at an Atlanta golf club. You have Ryan Lochte, Frank Kaminsky. Like there's so much range. I'm trying to figure out like, okay, what's the theme here? What's the trend? And I feel like my head would spin if I try to piece it all together. So you tell me, is there any theme or trend, or is it just you're interested in pursuing something new and different? So just walk us through, I guess, just initially, like, what are you looking for?
So I would say if there is an underlying theme, because like you said, they're all so different in terms of subject matter, sport, where they are in their careers, et cetera. It's more, will the story have staying power? Will it be impactful if I'm covering something 6 months after a news event has happened, or if it's a retired athlete like a Clinton Portis or Sean Bradley, or Ryan Lochte was at the very nearly retired and kind of trying a comeback. Will people still care about this? And then will it have staying power? Will it be the definitive look at this person or subject? That's the litmus test I give myself early. Um, and so that's the underlying theme, I'd say. And that's when, as I'm consuming news, I will, for instance, Sean Bradley gets in a bicycle crash, he gets hit by a car, put a pin in that. Okay, that's something that is obviously tragic and terrible and was a big deal when it happened. I think this is something people are going to really care about, and I think there's layers there down the road as far as how it affects a family. What will the caregiver community rally around this and find an emotional connection with the Bradleys? Will his story help spread awareness about people in these situations? So those are the kind of questions I ask myself up front, put a pin in it, and then either with time, if you work with an editor long enough, that one in particular, I think we send each other independent of each other the same day. Hey, well, let's look at this one down the road. We just knew it would be the right fit, or it's something that I think that 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road, they'll be interested in. So I just keep a running file, and if it's been a particularly tough situation like that, you have to kind of gauge how much time do I want to give them. I don't want to get beat on the story, but I also don't want to be the first one to send the message and essentially harass them, because
Yeah.
you have to try to kick the door down, but you have to do so tactfully. So I try to find the right timing and balance as far as getting access and not coming off too aggressive. That's a tricky part of it too.
That's really interesting because it requires then on your part, I would think, a level of social emotional intelligence to be able to, for lack of a better phrase, kind of read the room, right?
Mhm.
Especially if we're talking about something time sensitive or something like that. Um, there's an urgency to it, right? But there's a sensitivity to who's on the other end of it. So that's really fascinating. So okay. We got a little bit about early on here. So now let's say, all right, I think this one has some staying power. I put a pin in it. I'm still thinking about it, right? It seems like maybe this is one that's worth following. Then what?
So it depends on frankly, how famous the athlete might have been, or how well known, and how many layers of people, protectors, gatekeepers you have to get through to get to them. So it changes based on that. So if Sean Bradley or Clinton Portis, you're going to have to go through former teams or agents, things like that, which was the case in both of them, to get access and kind of sell yourself. For the piece like James Hardy, former NFL player, wasn't super well known, tragically committed suicide after long bout with with identity issues and mental health issues. That's more, okay, try to find folks in his orbit. So for that one, I always start with a clip search, an in-depth clip search of anything that's ever been written about someone within reason, and do a lot of research there. And that one, you try to find themes, et cetera, you want to explore in their past. But two, it's to find people in their orbit, contacts that you'll want to get to. And so for
Yeah.
Hardy, it was a high school basketball coach and a high school football coach that I was able to ping and get early phone calls with them. And those phone calls, they go well, and they can tell, you're interested, you're coming from a good place. They'll kind of be advocates for you, working your way into a tragic situation like that, where maybe you start on the periphery, you're not going straight to a parent or a spouse, you're starting on the periphery just to get a feel for it, and they can open doors for you. And that was very much the case in that piece. I think I talked to 30 plus people for that story, and it started with those two coaches who were able to kind of vouch for me within Hardy's family and Hardy's community to help me tell that story. Whereas
Yeah.
Sean Bradley, it's he had a very prominent agent, David Falk, who we all know, Michael Jordan's agent, and so that required going to Falk from the bat, and a lot of back and forth with him. I think it was about on and off for 6 months or so of just back and forth with David, explaining, here's who I am, here's what I've done, here's the approach, here's why we want to do it. him kind of testing and pushing me, and then also once he thought it was okay, this is a good idea, also talking to Sean and saying, hey, I think this will be a good idea for X, Y, and Z reasons. You can help other people in your situation. People are clamoring for this story, and I think this is the guy that can tell it based on his past work in our phone conversations. So there's different ways in, but those are kind of the two tracks, just depending on how prominent who you're writing
Okay.
about is.
I mean, you said starting with a clip search. I'm just curious, does that mean like you're just Googling, or do you have access to archives, based on, what's been written, and that's all in some sort of central place?
That's a great question. So it's a mix. It's I have access to LexisNexis, which is a huge database. A lot of lawyers use it for legal court cases, things like that. But there's also a news service where you can put in search terms, and it'll pull anything from. It's not all encompassing. I think like some old magazine stories won't be there, but pretty much anything that's on a wire news service or that's ever been in a newspaper for the last several decades will be there. And so you just get good at using search terms, and I won't say that's all of it, but that's probably 70% of it. And then do make sure you Google to find, when I did Lochte, there'd been an ESPN magazine story on him maybe 10 years before that wouldn't have shown up in LexisNexis, but I wanted to be sure to revisit that as well. So you kind of blend those together. Yeah.
Okay. How about this? Do you always know from the start the direction of the story and where you want to take it? Like, do you know the thesis from the beginning essentially, or are you letting that almost develop and kind of tell itself the more doors you open, people you talk to, information you get?
It's a little bit of both. You have to come in with a general thesis as part when you pitch a story. You have to tell your editors, and I guess I should back up because that's barrier one is okay. I've put my pen in it. I've done my research. Now I have to put a pitch together to sell my editors on it. Even if it's an editor you've worked with a lot and trust, you've
Brian,
got to get it.
That feels like an important step we skipped.
Yes. That one's vital. And so you get the pitches in front of them that basically explain, okay, here's why I want to do it. Here's why it's important. Here's why it'll still be relevant, et cetera. And they're quick. They're a couple paragraphs, and then sometimes it requires some back and forth with an editor. Okay, hey, really drill it home for me, because then maybe they have to go sell it to the editor in chief or something on your behalf. And so that's a long back and forth. So I usually send those in batches, maybe 5 or 6 at a time. And they'll say, okay, we like these 2 or 3. We've gotten approval. Go ahead and dig into them. And maybe one will yield a piece that we run. So for every, call it 2 or 3, I start, maybe get a few phone calls in, maybe that yields maybe one story, because sometimes you'll hit roadblocks or dead ends, things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that in itself, again, that's not something I necessarily would have known. So it sounds like, hey, I've got to a degree, it's like I've got to put some shots on goal and just get a feel for like what's here. Or, golf analogy, like what's the best ball, right? If I hit 3 or 4 off the tee, let's take the best one and run with that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Particularly for the sort of work I do, where they're going to invest a fair amount of time, my time and energy, the editor's time and energy, and then the resources to travel. Like for the Bradley story, I made two big trips over the course of a month, and they're pouring resources into it. So they've really got to land and resonate. And as far as your question about does the thesis change? Yes, it does. Not always. So the Albany story about the high school football team in the pandemic, I had a very clear sense of what I wanted that piece to be and what I thought the piece would be, kind of looking at systemic issues that it created the environment where Albany was, at the start of the pandemic, you hear New York, you hear big cities are affected, but then tiny little Albany, Georgia, why? Well, there's a lot of history there and socioeconomic disparities that would create an environment where the virus would impact them more. And so that was something that just through reading and being a news consumer, I'd put together, and I thought, okay, there's going to be something here. Let's see if you go and test the thesis, you make sure that's the case when you go do your reporting. And it very much was when I did that. Whereas on some of the other stories, Clinton Portis, I knew he was gregarious and well-known and a big figure and had gone through financial strife. And that was about it. And it was just more of there's got to be something here. So if we can get access to him, let's see what he says. And it turns out there was a lot that we didn't know and a lot that he shared about, his thinking about he was going to kill one of his financial advisors that had duped him. And it became a big deal. But that's just because I had a bit of a hunch or an inclination to chase it and see if there was something there. But certainly going into it, that was not part of the pitch because we didn't know it.
Yeah.
So those evolve. They can evolve case by case as you go, and certainly the themes, the more subtle themes within them, will evolve. Like the Lochte piece, we knew it was okay. He's trying to come back. This seems foolhardy. He's past his prime. And then it became a piece about kind of self-flagellation, essentially about I'm punishing myself because of my past sins. I'm going to put my body through hell for the sake of what I put my family through. And I couldn't have articulated it that clearly in a pitch, but as you spend a good, couple weekends with him and get to know his family and talk to all his friends, that becomes very apparent. So you can have an inkling, but then the details reveal themselves as you report.
Interesting. So I think I probably know the answer to this based on just already what we've discussed, but does each story follow sort of a similar predetermined structure or process that you're going through? I know every story is going to be different, but your process, is it changing based on the nature of the story and just you're kind of letting things unravel? Or is it like, no, there's always tends to be generally like step A, B, C, and so on? Um, again, is everyone just unique? It has its own process and you're sort of figuring it out as you go.
So I have a very fixed, rigorous process. It's funny, my wife thinks I'm really, oh, you're so creative, you're a writer. It's no, I'm a process guy. It's all rigor, it's rigor and structure and process, and it yields that undergirding structure gives you room to be creative
Mm.
at the end. Essentially, that's where the fun part where you're playing with the words and making them really sing. And finding themes and connecting dots. That's the fun part. But you only get there if you've stuck to this very rigorous process, at least for me. And I'm just speaking for me and a couple other writers I know that everyone has their own way to get there. Usually there is some structure or process they adhere to, and everyone's is different. Um, but mine is hyper structured just because frankly, I know where my shortcomings are in terms of balancing all this information at one time. So I knew I had to put structures in place in order to make sure I don't miss anything or don't miss any connections or details. So yeah, my process, it starts with, like I said, the research, and then you jump into initial interviews and then try to leverage initial sources to get more sources. Definitely, I try to, whenever possible, make sure that it's a story I can travel for because I know my strengths are in sensory details in my writing, so I want to be able to capture sensory details in my storytelling. So that's being in the room. If I can't be in the room, try to find photos, even go on Google Earth to find a house that you can't visit, sort of thing. I take pictures when I'm out reporting because if I need to describe a scene, it's great to have that visual evidence to reference rather than scribbling madly in my notebook. So just little tricks I pick up along the way. Or if I've left an interview where I can't be scribbling, I need to be engaged, but there's environmental stuff I want to capture. As soon as I get back to the rental car, the first thing I do is I pull out my voice recorder and talk into it with kind of, I just call them voice memos, environmental stuff. Some themes became apparent in the interview or sensory details that I couldn't write down. So I just make sure to capture those as soon as I can to leave myself little breadcrumbs. And once you have all that, let's say, for a given feature, you're talking to between 10 and 30 people and you've got a couple hundred pages of news clips and maybe you've got, if it's a trend piece, you've got research papers. If it's about concussions in football, you're going to have research papers. If it's about pitching injuries, you're going to have research on that, et cetera. So it's an amalgamation, and I always have one big file that has research clips, interview transcripts, which I use software called Otter to transcribe for me because it would take literally a month to transcribe all these. So those are all subfolders. It probably takes, depending on the story, about 2 or 3 full days to carefully review. I review every page of it. And I pull out into kind of thematic chunks. I'll have a document that's, early, if it's a profile, it's early in life, college, later career, retirement, et cetera. Just depends on the story, but there's thematic chunks. Anything that I think may be a detail that works its way into the story I need to know, I will pull from those documents and group them thematically. I then spend a day or so reviewing that. That subsequent document may be 150, 200 pages. I review that and then use that to build the outline. And so now I've got my thematic chunks, but now as I build the outline, I'm finding structure and themes, and it's not all going to be chronological. Like maybe you start the Lochte story later in his career where he's having a bad practice and crying after. And that's a really important scene that as I was reporting, I kind of knew, oh, that's probably the beginning of the piece. And then you ask other people about it. And now you've got input, 4 or 5 people that had line of sight into that incident, and you group that in the outline and the lead. And then you do that throughout the rest of the piece. And I have a long outline put together. And then from that, I spend about, I can usually do it in a full day to write the first draft. Sometimes it's a day and a half where I'll have the outline up, and then I will just hammer out the grossest, most incomprehensible rough drafts. Like if you read it, you would think this guy gets paid to write. I can't believe it. You'd be stunned. But it's my way. I just have to get it out. The structure's there. I just have to get all the words out. And it's messy. It's sloppy. It's way too long. I usually write about 5,000 word stories. Those are about 10 pages in the magazine, and it might be 9 or 10,000 words in the rough draft. But I just get it all out, and it's messy. And then I spend about, if I have the time, I'll take a full week to polish kind of section by section the next week, or sometimes it's 2 or 3 days. It just depends on deadlines and my work schedule. But that's the nuts and bolts of the writing process. But I'm happy to, if you have questions on getting into the weeds
No,
there, I'd
hey,
love
look,
to.
man, I'm just sitting here fascinated by it. And so I think we noted this from the start, but like, man, if there's anything I can nerd out on, it's some process. So this is
Yeah.
like music to my ears. I just personally, to me, it's just really, really interesting to hear you break it down with so much depth and clarity, because what it shows me is like you've been developing this process for 15 years, right?
Yep.
And it'll, I'm sure, continue to evolve. But where it is today, like there's so much confidence in it and how you talk about it. There's so much clarity, exactly what each of the steps is. Um, I just hope our listeners, regardless of what industry they're in, they hear that and it's like, oh, that's what it sounds like to really like master something. You know what I mean? Or to really have a process in place. And so I won't dig into too much of the details of the process itself. I think part of my realization as you were talking though, and I'm just maybe not too clued into what a journalism degree and what it might look like
Hmm.
to really have a background in this. I mean, man, I'm like, okay, so I mentioned earlier like social emotional intelligence, like you're part psychologist, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's pieces in there that I just, it's almost like you've got to know how to like break down a crime scene almost, right? Like there are all these different skill sets involved in what you do. I'm curious, you kind of, I think maybe alluded to this, but I want you to spell it out. What are your strengths within this space? What are the things that seem to just come most naturally for you? And what have you really had to work at developing?
It's a good question. So, and to your point about, not knowing a lot about journalism school and things like that, I will say most of what I just articulated is all kind of self-created. I mean, they teach you the nuts and bolts of kind of how to interview, basic strategies, how to structure a basic news story. But everyone who's kind of made this level, my friends in the space, they all create their own processes just through
Yeah.
trial and error and what suits them. And as far as strengths and weaknesses, I mean, I definitely, I know that I'm confident in my ability to, when I get to that polish stage, that I can execute if I've done everything else. Like I'm very confident in what I can do with words. Um, I'm less confident in my ability to immediately identify compelling themes, or to report, and so much, like you said, so much of what I do is based on making connections with folks, being emotional and empathetic, and I think I am, but I don't love the reporting process. Like I don't love having to pick up the phone and talk to folks and then talk to someone else and talk to someone else. And it's to me that's emotionally draining. And so that's the part where I know I really have to push myself. And you'll hit a crossroads where I kind of think I have it, but there's that one scene where this one other person they mentioned would have a good line of sight that would raise the story. It would make it 4% better, call it
Mhm.
5% better. And there's those moments where you're wiped out. Yeah, I think I'm a critical mass, but that's where I have to remind myself, no, pick up the phone, man, do the 20-minute call because it's worth it. Because this piece will live on forever, and hopefully, if you've done it well, will be the definitive accounting of X, Y, or Z incident. So do the extra call. So that's kind of where my weaknesses were coming in. I would, only child, a bit introverted. Don't love, you think journalists like, oh, you're out and about, you're in the field, you're talking to folks. Like that part, especially starting out at Business Week, was terrifying for me. I mean, it was absolutely like staring at the phone and knowing I have to call some CEO when I was 21 was horrifying. And so I had to overcome that. And I still, to this day, I'll get a little nervous before interviews or phone calls, not because it's not like, oh, it's someone that's famous. It's more, I know the bar I have to clear to make an immediate connection with someone, and I know what I need to get out of it as far as mining for details. And I'm maybe a little less confident in myself, even though I've done it thousands of times, going into that than I am if I'm sitting at my computer by myself and I've got my documents up, and that's when I feel in control.
Yeah.
It's less in control when you're out trying to gather the information, and that's where I know a lot of people in the industry that are the exact opposite, where they have the gift of gab and are super extroverted and are super good at warming up to people and naturally warm and building sources, and that's a huge great skill set. But
Mhm.
then you put them in front of a computer and that's where they're tortured and they can't
Yeah.
and they hate that part. So it's different for everyone. But to your point, my weakness is more on the reporting side, and that's where I have to push myself.
Okay.
And I think that's maybe why I created those structures in the
Yeah.
reporting and outlining process to kind of overcome those deficiencies.
No, I think it's really, really cool, man. They're just again, the more we talk, it's like there's so much involved here. It feels like, yeah, there are elements that just your personality, how you're wired, you're going to be geared toward and excel in these areas. But just because it's so encompassing, there are certainly some things where like you've got to learn how to do this and develop in these areas. So I appreciate you sharing some of that. So, all right, next question here, back to our process. When do you feel like you've had enough? You sort of described the critical mass thing and like it could be a little bit more. Is it finally just where like, hey, I've checked every box in terms of I've talked to all the people that have been mentioned. I think all the key players here have been identified and so on. Um, that's just got to be a strange story. So one, it's when do I feel like I have enough information that I can write, correct?
Correct.
And then two, now I've actually written it, but what is the right amount of like how do I finally feel like I've hit a point where the piece is finished? Like there are almost two separate endpoints to this. So talk through that a little bit.
Definitely are. Great question. So the critical mass on reporting, that's more of a learned skill, much like the process. Like you said, I didn't start day one doing my first long feature. I didn't have anywhere close to this process established. And I certainly didn't have a sense of when I had enough or too much reporting. And that's through doing, I think I've done 40 to 50 of these kind of 5,000 word pieces through my career. And that's just reps. And then you just kind of have a sixth sense about it. And I certainly veered too far in the over reporting direction early on because I'd read about Gary Smith, SI legend, or what Wright Thompson does at ESPN, and you try to read and study up on the people you want to emulate and whose careers you appreciate, and just how many people they talk to each for their stories. And I was like, well, I've just got to go above and beyond every single time. And then I reached a certain point where I realized, okay, for some stories, yes, for some stories, it can be more narrow and more focused, and that's overkill, and you're kind of wasting time, and maybe it'll even muddy up the story itself. Like for the you mentioned the course murder story. I'd done a bunch of reporting on his both the family of the victim and then also the perpetrator and his background, and we kind of had interwoven, at least in my first draft, interwoven both of those stories. But it was too much of a mishmash. It was too long. It lost focus, and through the edit, I realized, oh, I probably could have left the murderer stuff. I wound up being a couple paragraphs toward the end, and it made the story better. And that's where you need an editor. But that's where also through reps you kind of realize, oh, I'm not doing a book report here. I'm telling a story, and it's very different. An all encompassing report on something is different than the narrow sliver thematically of a narrative that you want to tell. And so that's just through repetition you learn kind of where to draw that line, and it's almost more of a gut feeling now when I know when I have it. And then on the back end, when I'm ready to file, that's again process based. That's just the polishing. I will, like I said, hammer out that first really hideous rough draft and then polish section by section, kind of a day per section if I'm lucky, sometimes two sections a day. And then read it and read it and read it almost until I don't know if you've had this experience with anything you've ever put together. You read something and then it's almost like you can't even read it. And it's almost like it's not
Oh
English
yeah.
anymore, you know?
Yeah, well, it almost gets to the point. That's what I was curious about. And then I mean, this is why I have an editor, of course, but where it's almost like I can't see the forest for the trees
Yes.
anymore. Like it all
Yep.
kind of gets lost in if there was glaring mistakes, I can't see them at this point.
Yep. And so the final read I do, I actually print it out because it changes how you're at least my, and I think other people have this experience when I'm reading something printed, I'm seeing it more clearly or I'm not rushing or scanning like I might on a screen. So that's my final really tidy up the grammar and basic things like that and look for that's almost a typo read. And there's sometimes a word choice thing will slip in there. But that's my final step is I'll do the printed read, mark it up, go make the changes, and then I say, okay, we'll send it off. Because I know I'm gonna get, for one of these, especially with SI magazines of that caliber, things that you're not turning around that go up online the day of. Um, those are the editing process, which I'd love to get into with you, is hyper rigorous, and so I get it to a great point, a point I'm very happy with. And even if my editor, I'll say I've shot with SI maybe 70%, 75% on editor says, "Hey, you nailed it." But even within that 75%, it comes back in a Google Doc with 200 comments and things that need to be reworked and reformatted and flipped on their head and major edits. I mean, that's just how it works at the highest levels of the profession. You come to expect that. You have to have thick skin early, and then you realize, no, they're just doing their job. You're a team. They're making the story better, and you learn to really appreciate that. Um, so I know when I'm filing, this is not what it's going to necessarily sound like verbatim when it runs, and we go
Yeah.
through a thorough edit, and then a closer line edit, and then the editor in chief or a second editor goes through and kind of tries to poke holes in it with their edit, and then it goes to a copy editor who irons out all the little grammatical details, and then a fact checker that I work with. I always fact check my own stuff, but the SI has a fact checker as well that I work with, where you give them all your notes and they double check everything and you compare notes and make sure everything's formatted appropriately. So that back end, once I've filed, you kind of feel like you're done. Like I'll try to file on a Friday and like go have a nice night out and okay, I can enjoy the weekend, but I know the next week is going to be just as hard because we're working
Yeah.
through edits and checks and everything.
Yeah, man, again, just so fascinating to get the behind the scenes on everything that goes into this. And it's just taking me back to like writing one dissertation, in that process. And now it's like, oh yeah, you're doing that multiple times a year. And it's like, man, that's really cool. So, all right, last, let's say tough question. And I told you I was going to come back to around to this, but now you've completed a piece. How do you define success for yourself as a writer?
That's a good one. Um, I know increasingly in our industry, a lot of people, I think I've had some conversations with writers who I really respect, and I've been surprised at how much value they derive from, oh, 3 million people read it. Like, did it have reach? And I was surprised to hear that from some of them, but I think that's because that's how, in terms of keeping a job or getting a promotion or being known or building a following, like that matters. That's never, I take pride in that. Like if I have had a few like Bradley and Portis, Hardy, et cetera, that like have done well, and I'm I'll I don't ask for the numbers. Sometimes they'll send them to me if they're big, and I take up, whoa, that's cool. But to me, that's not why I did it. It's, to me, success is, uh, did you capture when you had that initial kernel of an idea, did it reach its potential? And I know when it has, and I know when it hasn't. I've had a couple for SI where if it was, my work schedule was too tight and I rushed it, or access was trickier and the profile subject just didn't give me enough time, or I didn't ask the right questions in the interview. I know when it's, hey, this is a B plus, and that I don't love that because I get so few cracks at it just based on the structure of my contract and kind of the nature of the work that I do, where I'm not doing the daily stuff. It's upsetting when I won't say
Yeah.
I miss, but when it doesn't reach potential, and that's just more of a personal thing. That's
Yeah.
just, it's kind of an internal thing.
Yeah, but I would argue, and this is where just coming from, what I do, and even going to people, I'm sure you're very well familiar with immersive, but like a John Wooden, right? Success is giving your best effort
Right,
as opposed to, the outcome and whatever's on the
right.
scoreboard. And that's kind of what you're differentiating, which I think is great to hear is, hey, it's awesome if I hear that this reached X number of people, and they read the story, that's cool. But that's sort of a byproduct of this really was my best effort and it's all
100%.
here. I saw it through. It's exactly what I envisioned. But in that case, then I think the reason why you said like it's a tough pill to swallow when you feel like I didn't quite get everything out of that one is because it's on you,
Hmm.
right? That has nothing to do with it didn't reach the number of readers I wanted. Like, no, this is about me. I could have got more out of it. I rushed it, like whatever. That's what I think is really cool and why I wanted to save that for, sort of our last big question. And so that I think is awesome to hear, you know.
Definitely. The it's more about process and fulfillment, and your craft more than the, like you said, the metrics, whatever it is, the reach. That's all just a byproduct of the work that you did.
Yeah.
So
Okay. All right. Just a couple, let's say, fun questions to wrap up here. You've mentioned a few names on the call, but some of your favorite writers or author, like who do you enjoy reading the most?
Well, certainly, I mean, I would say at SI, Greg Bishop's someone I've always looked up to and have had a chance to get to know him recently, and he's tremendous at what he does. And I've talked process with him, and it's funny that he is so fast. Like he can put out 5,000 words in a week, whereas I just described my process, and that's a month or two, right? So I envy his ability to still execute well and do so quickly. I think, I mean, probably universally regarded one of the best, if not the best, of the last decade or so is Wright Thompson at ESPN. He's just remarkable. Seth Wickersham and Don Van Natta at ESPN. They have a really strong team over there. Tim Keown at ESPN is really solid. And then in other arenas too. I mean, I always love Mark Leibovich's work. There's people all across the board. I always tried to make a point to spend time reading the sort of work I wanted to do.
Yeah,
Taffy Ackner, New York Times Magazine, Sam Anderson at New York Times Magazine. He has a version of what I do at a much higher level, where I think he's on contract for 3 or 4 big ones a year on staff for New York Times Magazine, and he'll go write 20,000 words, and slightly different structure at SI. We don't really run stories that long, but that's
yeah,
to me that's a bit of a dream next step or dream job where you're doing really really in depth things 3 months
yeah.
at a time, and he really does. He hits them out of the park.
Okay. No, that's interesting. I appreciate you sharing. All right. Favorite publication, all-time favorite book. What are you now less about who, but what are you reading?
So, gosh, that's a good one. So, favorite publication. I mean, I think it's universally kind of classic SI, 80s, 90s, that sort of thing. Grew up reading that. That's my favorite. I think going now, I think the New York Times Magazine and the Atlantic are kind of best in class as far as magazines go. And then book. I mean, I grew up reading. It's funny. I grew up reading fiction, and I pivoted. I read almost exclusively nonfiction now. I think just because that's to me, it's like I won't call it homework, but I want to read like I
Yeah.
said, what I want to do. But I grew up reading a lot of Steinbeck. I really liked Steinbeck quite a bit. I'd read and John Grisham. I mean, I really love his stuff. I will say probably I think the best executed nonfiction sports book I've read is called Scoreboard Baby by I think it's Ken Anderson, and it's about the Huskies football team in the early '90s, and it's a really exceedingly well done because it melds very high level investigative journalism because it's about them being big shots in a small town and how administrators and police would look the other way to the malfeasance of the team. And that can sound kind of dry and icky, but it melds investigative techniques using documents, court records, et cetera, with beautiful narrative storytelling. So it's a compelling. It reads almost like a novel. And Friday Night Lights was this way, and that's why that was
Yeah.
such a pillar of the industry. Is it's nonfiction, but it reads like a novel, and it has important messages thematically about culture and society. Those to me, that's the highest level when you can do big themes, make it a compelling read, but base it in stuff that really matters and is hard to get. And most of what they got for that book and for Friday Night Lights is tough to get material.
Yeah. Yeah, really good stuff. All right, man, your opportunity here, plug whatever you want. Where can our listeners learn more about you, read some of your stories? Where can they find all things you?
Gotcha. Well, I'm check out my portfolio site, brianburnshead.com. It's got several of my big features from Sports Illustrated that I've tackled over the last few years. I'm on X, formerly Twitter, at Brian Burnshead. Less active there of late because the platform's gotten a bit scattershot recently, but I still check in from time to time. And then as the dust settles on this SI ownership transition, look for more from me with SI here in the coming months.
Awesome. Hey, Brian, thanks so much for your time, man. This was really, really awesome. I think our listeners will be really, hopefully, as interested and as fascinated as I was to get some of the details on how you do what you do. So thanks again for the time, man.
Thanks. Great questions. I really appreciate a chance to get into the weeds on all that.